Welcome back to the guided video tour of this document, the Timeline.pdf spreadsheet. In the last two videos, we've established our anchor point when Caleb is 85 years old. This is the 7th year after Joshua brought the people across the Jordan River. This is also the point in time where we begin connecting the spans of time that are given to us beginning in Judges chapter 3. We're told that Israel was sold into the hand of Cushan-Rishathaim, king of Mesopotamia, for 8 years. Then Othniel saved them, and they had peace for 40 years, and then Othniel died. Othniel is Caleb's nephew, and we were already introduced to him earlier in the book of Joshua. It's during the second half of Othniel's 40 years of peace that Joshua died at 110 years old. Since Joshua is not anchored to the timeline like Caleb is, we give Joshua a plus or minus of 5 years based on the information that we do have. This is very similar to what we did with Kohath and Amram, where we know how many years they lived, but we're not given their specific age at any known event on the timeline, like we are with Caleb. Caleb was 40 years old when Moses sent him up from Kadesh in the 2nd year after the children of Israel came out of the land of Egypt. In the year before that, between the Exodus and arriving at Mount Sinai, Joshua led the army against the Amalekites. Joshua is also described as a young man, the servant of Moses. We can speculate that Joshua was between 19 and 29 years old when he defeated the Amalekites. It may be possible to speculate more accurately on Joshua's age, but it's really not necessary because Joshua is not used to reconcile the timeline like Caleb is. Knowing that Joshua died at 110 simply provides context for the phrase found in Joshua chapter 24 and Judges chapter 2 that says, Israel served the Lord all the days of Joshua and the elders who outlived him. So this generation is gone, but before we continue, let's recap some of the main sins by this generation and the generation before them so we can see which generation they belong to and the chronology and context for each one. When they first came out of Egypt and traveled to Mount Sinai, they made a golden calf. Then at the beginning of the next year, the 2nd year after the children of Israel came out of the land of Egypt, the tabernacle was set up, and Nadab and Abihu died for their sin. Then when they left Mount Sinai near the end of the 2nd month and headed for Kadesh, they complained about the manna, and God sent them waist-deep quail. Also before they got to Kadesh is when Miriam and Aaron spoke against Moses, and Miriam was struck with leprosy. Once they got to Kadesh, the spies were sent out, and they came back with a bad report. They refused to trust God and would not go in to take possession of the land. Next, we have Korah's rebellion, when the Lord opened up the earth and swallowed them. Then the very next day, the people rebelled, and 14,700 people were killed in a plague. Then they wandered in the desert until all those 20 years old and above had died. At the end of the wilderness wanderings, in the 40th year after the children of Israel came out of the land of Egypt, we have a new generation that is preparing to enter the Promised Land. At the beginning of this year, Moses incorrectly strikes the rock for water, and because of this, he will not be allowed to cross the Jordan at the beginning of the next year. Then the people travel around Moab and Edom, and on the way, this new generation complained about the manna, and God sent fiery serpents among them. This is when Moses made the bronze serpent and lifted it up. A few months later, after defeating Sihon and Og east of the Jordan, the Israelites commit harlotry with Moabite women in Baal worship, and God sent a plague among the people, which Phinehas stopped with a javelin. At the beginning of the next year, Joshua brought the people across the Jordan where Achan sinned at Jericho by taking from the devoted things, and as a result, the Israelites were defeated at Ai. As we saw in the last video, The sins in Judges chapters 17 through 21 concerning Micah's idolatry and the Levite and his concubine can also be attributed to this second generation. Then Judges chapter 2 verse 10 says, "When all that generation had been gathered to their fathers, another generation arose after them, who did not know the Lord, nor the work which he had done for Israel." This is when we see Eglon, king of Moab, along with the Ammonites and the Amalekites, take over Jericho, and Israel serves Eglon 18 years. If we remember from the account of the Levite and his concubine, the tribe of Benjamin was just recently decimated and reduced to 600 men, and Jericho was in Benjamite territory. Then we have Ehud, the left-handed Benjamite, which should bring to mind the left-handed Benjamite warriors mentioned in Judges 20:16, also from the account of the Levite and his concubine. Ehud kills Eglon, king of Moab, and Israel has peace for 80 years. Then in Judges 3:31, we're told that Shamgar came after him and killed 600 Philistines, but we're not given a length of time for Shamgar. Instead, we are told that when Ehud was dead, Jabin, king of Canaan, oppressed Israel 20 years. And we can see that Deborah's song mentions Shamgar as contemporary with Jabin's oppression of Israel. At the end of Deborah's song, we're told that the land had rest for 40 years. Next, the Lord delivered Israel into the hand of Midian for 7 years. Then Gideon rescued them, and the country was quiet for 40 years. After Gideon, his son Abimelech tried to become king, but he was killed after 3 years. Then in the first 3 verses of chapter 10, we are given 2 more judges and the years that they governed. The translation would seem to indicate that these 3 men judged one after another, but just as we saw in the last video with Judges chapter 1 verse 1, the wording does not accurately portray the order of events. The anchor points and synchronisms provided in Scripture will define the chronology for us, as we have already seen. After the Ammonites oppress Israel 18 years, Jephthah comes on the scene and gives us the anchor point for reconciling the chronology. Jephthah recounts the events from the 40th year after they came out of Egypt, and he tells us exactly how long ago it was, 300 years. So with each row of our spreadsheet representing a year, we can simply count off 300 years from our anchor point, the 40th year after they came out of Egypt, which was the same year that Sihon was defeated. This anchors the first year of Jephthah judging to our absolute timeline. It's to here that we can connect the previous 18 years of Ammonite oppression. We can see that this puzzle piece attaches perfectly to the end of Jair's 22 years and continues the geographical theme, Jair and Jephthah, both in Gilead, where the Ammonites were oppressing them. The Ammonites began oppressing Gilead when Jair died after judging 22 years. Notice in verse 9 of Judges chapter 10 that the Ammonites expanded their oppression west of the Jordan River to include Ephraim, and this corresponds to Tola, who judged in Ephraim and died the year after Jair. After Jephthah judged 6 years, we have 3 more judges that served at the same time in different geographical regions. Once again, the way the text reads is misleading and may cause us to believe that they ruled one after another, but as we will see again in this case, the anchor points in the chronology will show us with certainty that they ruled at the same time. Next, we are introduced to Samson, who comes on the scene after 40 years of Philistine oppression. A careful reading of Judges chapter 10 verses 7 and 8 reveals to us that the 18 years of oppression by the Ammonites before Jephthah were accompanied by 18 years of oppression by the Philistines. Jephthah ended the oppression of the Ammonites, but the Philistine oppression continued until 40 years were completed and Samson began to judge. Using only the text in Judges, this configuration could be considered speculative, but with our ironclad anchor point of the 480th year after they came out of Egypt, we will see that this chronology is not speculative, but precise and certain. So Samson judged Israel 20 years, and that's as far as we can go using the book of Judges. To make our connection, we need to use Samuel, Kings, and Chronicles to work backward from our anchor point, the 480th year after the children of Israel came out of the land of Egypt. The Bible has been very deliberate in identifying both the second year after and the 40th year after the children of Israel came out of the land of Egypt. With each row of our spreadsheet representing a year, we can simply count our way to the 480th year after they left Egypt, which the Bible synchronizes to the 4th year of Solomon's reign. From here, we can label the 3rd, 2nd, and 1st year of Solomon. 2 Samuel 5:4 tells us that David reigned 40 years, so we place David's 40 years into our spreadsheet before Solomon. 1 Chronicles chapter 3 verse 4 breaks down David's 40 years to 33 years in Jerusalem and 7 years, 6 months in Hebron. So we label this distinction on our spreadsheet as well. Then we notice that David brought the Ark of the Covenant to Jerusalem when he began to reign there. The Ark was brought from the house of Abinadab, where we're told specifically that the Ark spent 20 years. So now this 20-year span of the Ark being at the house of Abinadab can be anchored to the timeline. Next, we look at the circumstances that brought the Ark to Abinadab's house, and we see that the Ark had been captured by the Philistines and was in Philistine possession for 7 months. This becomes an important anchor point on our timeline because of the many synchronisms attached to it. When the Ark was captured, Eli's sons, Hophni and Phinehas, died, his grandson Ichabod was born, and Eli himself died. We're told that Eli was 98 years old when he died, so now Eli is anchored to the timeline, and we're told that he judged Israel 40 years. When we plug Eli's 40 years into our absolute timeline spreadsheet, something amazing happens. Eli's first year of judging begins immediately after Samson's last year of judging, and thus we have our second confirmation that the period of the judges has now been correctly reconciled in our timeline spreadsheet. All of these numbers can be easily cross-checked and verified. The absolute timeline up to Solomon has now been reconciled, meeting both of the criteria established by the Bible. The first being that the 4th year of Solomon is the 480th year after they left Egypt, and the second criteria is the 300-year span of time between when Sihon was defeated and the first year of Jephthah judging. There is only one way all of these numbers can be arranged correctly to meet both of these criteria. In the next video, we will look a little bit more closely at Eli, Samuel, Saul, David, and Solomon. You can download the complete Timeline PDF spreadsheet, perfect for referencing on your computer, tablet, or phone, by clicking on the link in the description in this video. May God bless you in your studies, and we'll see you here next time.